non-evident in our lives, at least to us, that we can trust in the certainty of God's power. We can be assured that God's power will not be swayed by our doubt, not be swayed by our unfaithfulness, not be swayed by evil in the world. It will not be swayed. In other words, Jesus describes a small seed growing from this small seed that grows into this large shrub to describe not only the potentiality of God's power in our lives, but also the certainty of God's power in our lives. It helps us to understand that God's power, we can be optimistic that God will work in our lives. But this is not immediate. It can take time. And there is some effort that is needed. Whereas in the previous parable, the person simply scatters the seeds and just kind of waits around, in this parable, it says that the mustard seed was sown. And to me, that talks a little bit about intentionality. That it wasn't just merely scattered, because Jesus could have said it was scattered, right? But he uses the word sown, like planted. And therein lies the difference, that sense of intentional care. And it reminds us that while we can trust in the certainty of God's power, it can take time and it takes work in our lives. Above all, it suggests that it takes faithful persistence. And it reminds us that as sure as God's power is, that there is work for us to do. In this time, I think the importance of faith and faithful living seems to hold less and less weight. We become more and more dependent on our ability and self-determination. In our time, we have seen the ever-increasing competition for our attention and for our effort. The time necessary to cultivate spiritual life, to cultivate spiritual living, to cultivate a faithful life, is given over to the work we put in to prop up our own life and lifestyles. And so, some of the questions I think we as a church need to ask is, where do we need to plant seeds of God's presence and God's power in our lives? In what areas do we need to cultivate the seed, fully expecting God to grow it into something larger than we could have imagined ourselves? Where have we planted the seed, but neglected to cultivate? What changes do we need in our lives in order to be able to put more time into cultivation? You see, this parable gives us a reason to expect God's power to influence our lives. Even when it seems like God's power is improbable. Even when we feel in life and ask ourselves, where are you, God, in all of this? The parable reminds us that God's power is certain and will not be swayed, but that it requires our participation. As I said in the beginning, I think it's important to read these parables together. In the first parable, the person does nothing to tend to the seeds, but he benefits with the harvest. And some people might be tempted to read this parable and say, you know what? We don't have to do anything. But I think what the parable conveys is not an excuse for inactivity, but emphasizes God's activity in our lives to grow us. In the second parable, the mustard seed seems so small that you wonder what can come out of such a small seed. But the gardener tends to the seed, and soon a great, large mustard shrub grows, and the birds benefit. And some believe that God's presence and power to be improbable in life. But But this parable, again, reminds us that we need to cultivate our faith because that's the work we need to do. Not only for our benefit, but for the benefit of others. So when we look at these parables side by side, in both parables we see similarities. Someone has to sow the seed. Someone has to sow the seed. It necessitates our participation. And there is benefit, not only for the individual, us, but also for the people around us. Now, the differences in the parables are these. I think it comes into emphasis. God is wholly responsible for growth in the first parable. But in the second parable, it sort of emphasizes this need for our participation to tend to that seed. There is intentionality. The seed was sown. And I think this creates an interesting tension. And I think it is in this where we find our call as the men of the church, but also of the church itself. The call is to faithful living, realizing that God is responsible for growth, but that there is work for us to do. On this Father's Day, I think this passage is a reminder to the men of the church that our most important work in life is to cultivate faith. So much of our life is spent providing things. But the thing that we can provide, the most important thing that we can provide is faith to our kids, faith to our families, faith to the people around us. During the week, one of our church members visited the office, and he was talking a little bit about kind of how you think about your parents, you perceive your parents. And the family was going through some things, and so a bunch of the siblings gathered, and they realized that each of them had a very different perspective on their families, on their parents. Mom was like this, dad was like that. Well, another sibling had a completely different view. And one of the questions he had, thoughts he had at the end was, I wonder how my kids think of me. And it made me realize that more than ever, in this time, in this world, we need men who will be faithful. Men who will grow the people around them. So the work of men is this. If you're going to provide anything, provide spiritual faithfulness. The men at work, we need men at work to do this, to be faithful models to the people around us. Not only our children and our spouses, but we need faithful models in this world, at our workplaces, in our homes, at our communities. Wherever we go, we need men who will be faithful models. We also need men who will cultivate faithful living wherever they go. That they are not simply in the business of being faithful themselves, but as men that we would work towards cultivating faithful living in the people around us, especially our children. And men at work, we need to provide spiritual support, not only to our kids and our families, but to the community and to this church, because God works in the men of the church. So we do need men at work. Let's encourage our fathers, our men, to be at work to provide spiritual support and direction for us. Let's celebrate their spiritual leadership and their spiritual care and their spiritual pursuit to be like Jesus. And in that way, the church, the community, the world can see them as models for faithful living and say, we want to be like you, just a little different. Happy Father's Day. Let's encourage the men of our church to faithful living. Let's pray.